Bored now. So last time I talked about Buffy, I gave you what I thought were the 10 best episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I gotta be fair, I gotta look at the other side of the coin and take a look at the worst episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And this list, for how long Buffy was on, how many episodes it had, did not have as many contenders as one might think. It's not to say the show was always perfect. It had its weak moments, it had its weak seasons, but truly bad episodes, at least in my estimation, are few and far between. I do have 10 here to talk about though. So let's get to it with number 10, iRobot, You Jane. So this is an episode that just sort of shows some of the initial growing pains of the show as a whole, I think. The whole thing with Willow kind of falling in love online with a weird demon thing, and then it gets a robot body. There's some not altogether uninteresting concepts in this, like the idea of ancient beings getting caught up and integrated in newer technology, things that didn't exist when they were around before. There's possibilities there, but I think in many ways this is one of the episodes that really, I don't think it was great at the time, but it's aged very poorly just with the way in which people talk about how the internet works, and it's sort of stoking the fires of the fear of what some stranger online could get you to do. And it's one of the things that results when you try and be topical, but you don't really have anything of substance to say. The episode just kind of regurgitated the generic fears of the time. And I mean, the show as a whole got a lot of mileage out of taking real-world high school age concerns and blowing them up to horrific proportions. But in this case, it was a concern of the time, of the 90s, that was already blown out of proportion in terms of the pop culture media. So blowing it up even further just doesn't work, really. And then, just kind of a boo. Number 9, New Moon Rising. It's not so much that this episode is awful in and of itself, but what it is a really lousy send-off for the character of Oz. And it's frustrating because it's the episode where they brought him back after he'd been gone for a while. So it's not even a case of he got a lousy send-off. He had an okay send-off before. This was their chance to give a proper, sense of closure, resolution to the character, and it doesn't really do that. He kind of comes back and he seems to have it under control, but he kind of doesn't, and then he leaves again. And that's kind of it. It's just kind of a weird... It's the sort of thing where, like, this, you got him back. This fan favorite character who we haven't seen in a while and aren't really going to see again outside of like a little glimpse of him in Restless, the Dream episode, and you brought him back and to tell this story? Really? You thought this was worth bringing him back? You thought this was the payoff that fans wanted? It felt obligatory. It felt like they brought him back because they'd left the door open to the possibility that he might come back. So like, we'll bring him back once and then we can just be done with him. That's just the feel and the vibe of the whole thing. Like I said, not necessarily a terrible episode in and of itself, but just the hollowness of it. It's just, for what should have been a fun, triumphant character return, it's just kind of nothing. Number 8, Living Conditions. This is an episode that should have worked. This was second episode of season 4 where Buffy and her roommate start grating on each other until eventually she finds out her roommate's a demon and they start trying to kill each other. And again, I've mentioned this already. It's playing to what had been working in Buffy up to that point, which was taking problems that the characters of the age that people the age of these characters have, and you blowing them up with horror tropes. But for some reason it doesn't quite work here. I think in a lot of ways it shows the stumbling nature of what the 4th season was, where okay, she graduated high school, what do? Have her go to college? I guess, but you know what? College problems, they don't feel that much different than high school problems. So after, the graduation and literally blowing up the school, we're just kind of dealing with what in many ways feels like reach. I know this specific issue wasn't dealt in earlier seasons, but like this whole approach to, teenage problems just feels like the show should be moving on from it. And it does eventually, season 5 and so forth. It does move on from that. But season 4, its big stumbling thing was not knowing how to move forward without also rehashing older stuff. And it kind of just flopped around a bit as a season. And this episode just kind of exemplifies that in a lot of ways. It's trying to be slightly different, but it's not different enough. And it feels like maybe the show should have ended with the destruction of that school, because if this is all you've got, I'm not sure it should have kept going. Like I said, thankfully it got better, but this was the kind of episode where it's like, boy, how much mileage is left. Number 6, Real Me. So this was our first Dawn focus episode. And this was before we knew what her deal was. We just knew she was there. And this was a very clear attempt to try and sell Dawn to the audience as a character. Get us to understand who she is. And it does that, but she's not endearing. She's frustrating and annoying. And I actually do kind of like Dawn as a character by the time the show was over. But man, when she first showed up, and especially this episode where it's focusing on her and it's from her perspective, and it's putting so much time and effort into, here, let us give you this character so that you can come to enjoy her. And by the end of it, I'm like, I appreciate the effort, but I just don't. Number 6, Gingerbread. I have a hard time pinpointing what it is about this episode that just rubs me the wrong way. I think it's just the extreme of it, I suppose. Just it's one of those cases where taking something that was a real world-ish problem and sort of blowing it up just made it overstepped. Like when you have, Joyce getting ready to kill her own kid, I'm like, I'm not buying this. And then beyond that, like the whole thing with, the scare of, witches and we should burn them and everything else, it also feels about a decade behind the times. Because, at the time the thing aired, it's not like that stuff didn't exist. I played Magic the Gathering. I remember the uproar people had about that because there were cards with the word demonic in them. I still got my demonic tutor cards. I should see if those are worth money. So that stuff was around at the time that this episode aired, but its heyday had been in the 80s, the satanic panic and, all these worries about lyrics in songs and this belief in that there were satanic cults out there. But while that sort of stuff was lingering by the 90s and when this episode aired, it was past. And a bit like with I, Robot You, Jane, it's taking something that is already overblown and then trying to blow it up even bigger. And it doesn't work when the show did that. It worked when it would take something fairly mundane, but that feels like a big deal when you're young and in high school, and blowing that up so that it actually is a big deal. But taking something that is already overblown out of proportion in the first place and trying to build on that, it doesn't work, and it didn't work here. Number 5, First Date. This is another one that's a little hard for me to pinpoint exactly what it is about this episode I don't like, but it's just... there's just so little going on, and it's not interesting, and it's not going anywhere, and it feels like a second season episode stuck in the middle of season 7, and it feels like filler. It feels like the ultimate epitome of crap. We need another episode this season. What can we do? Some of our characters are single right now. Let's have a first date episode, and we got this. Again, it's hard for me to articulate because this is one I've gone out of my way to not watch again, because I remember watching it just being like, what is this? Why is this? Can we stop now? It's just regressive, and it's another one of those cases where it feels like they're reaching back for stuff that the show had moved on from, because even though you're trying to frame it in like adult first dates, first date problems feels like a season 2, season 3, maybe season 4 kind of issue. This is season 7. This is last season. We're supposed to be closing out. Why are you doing this? Number 4, teacher's pet. Yeah, the big old mantis teacher thing. And I'll side note this real quick. Well, I'm not going to bring up the fact that, like, there was a cliffhanger that was never resolved because of an egg and no one ever found... Like, I've seen that show up on write-ups for the show or whatever. It's like, no, it wasn't there to be something to be picked up later. It was there because they were riffing on the kinds of horror, teenage horror stories that usually ended like that. Not so that you can have a sequel, because that's how those things tended to end. So that doesn't count against this. But I mean, first of all, this was a case of the creature concept was an overreach of their budgetary capabilities, and also, just big bug, giant mantis, not particularly creative. I get annoyed when shows, have the possibility of presenting us basically anything, and they just give us a big version of a thing that already exists. That's just boring to me. But even beyond that, the whole concept of like, ooh, and now Xander's gonna be tempted, and there will be frictions, like, she likes me and you don't, yelling at Will. It's like, it was so predictable. And I think that's its biggest sin more than anything else. Although the other stuff doesn't help, but it is just so beat for beat, note for note, predictable from start to finish. You can plot out basically the entire thing as soon as it starts, and which makes it boring on top of everything else. Number 3, Doublemeat Palace. This is one where part of its problem is, well, I would say a big part of its problem is placement within the show. Dealing with having a crappy first job is the kind of thing that is good for Buffy to tackle. But it's tackling it in season 6 after Buffy lost her mom and in a really amazing, very somber affair. And we're still picking up the pieces from that, and we have this weird, jokey episode where she goes to work for a weird fast food chain and feels like a jackass being there and is humiliated, and there's some stuff weird going on there. And again, it feels like the show is regressing. It feels like it should have been a season 3 or 4 kind of episode. And I think in many ways that the show kind of paid the price for not having had Buffy get a job up to that point, because now that her mother was dead, she had to, and they probably went, they either went, oh, maybe there's a story there, or they went, oh crap, we gotta make a thing out of this now, when it's something that really should have happened before. She should have had a crappy summer job, like in one of the earlier seasons, and so that we could get that out of the way. At this point, again, it just feels like something the show should have either done sooner or just not bothered to be doing at the point in which it's doing it. Its placement in the show overall and within the season it just kind of lands with a thud. Number 2, Go Fish, is another one that would just be generic if it wasn't for its placement within the season. This is the last episode before the 2-parter that ends season 2. Now, season 2 had Angel go evil and had what I did in my best list, had that 2-part season finale, best thing the show ever did. But right before, we're going to have this completely divergent episode dealing with these swimmers turned into fish people. Okay? And taking completely unto itself, it's just kind of dull and boring and slightly obligatory, because early on the show kind of went through, well, we do vampires, we got to do our version of a werewolf, we got to do our version of Frankenstein, we got to do our version of zombies, and now here's our version of the creature from the Black Lagoon. So it already feels very obligatory by its nature, but then placing it where they place it, instead of like giving us even more, better, stronger build up to this amazing finale, we're stopping to do this. Really. it's the epitome of the kind of episode you just skip over when you rewatch. And number one worst episode for Buffy, folks who are hoping for a rant along the lines of when I did my worst Moffat written episodes of Doctor Who, you can keep your expectations in check. Because as bad as this episode is, it doesn't make me that angry. But let's talk about Inca Mummy Girl. This is just a case where nothing works. Like the concept doesn't work. The show can't seem to decide how we're supposed to feel about this girl herself. And I think it's trying to be like tragic, like she doesn't want to do this, but she has to. But they're not balancing that right. And when she's talking to anybody other than Xander, she's not showing any sign of remorse. And so we're not getting a proper sense of torment from her because she doesn't seem to have a problem killing anybody else. And then she does eventually lunge for Xander. And so there was a chance to have a real torn moment there. And we don't get it. The effects aren't great. We've got Xander sort of falling for somebody that's liable to kill him again. And by this point, it was becoming a rather regular repeated thing because we'd already had it in the first season with Teacher's Pet, which I already talked about. And that one wasn't good either. So here we are retreading something that wasn't great the first time around. And just the pacing and the structure, it's weird and it's boring and it's dull and it there's no tension in it, and she's not interesting as a character. And like I said, just this is an episode where just nothing worked. There's no one element of like, oh, all this stuff, but that one thing. There is that, like, no, there's just nothing. Like, no, it's not like everything's awful. It's just nothing's good. There's nothing good about this episode. The setup is trite. The character is dull. The progression is boring and a retread of something we already had. It's just not good. So there's my list. My thoughts for what I think are the 10 worst episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a show that I love. But we always have to acknowledge the fault. So, what are your thoughts for worst episodes of Buffy? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all that stuff you can do. Support me on Patreon, buy a t-shirt, follow me on Twitter, blah, 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 blah. Links for all my other projects and all that stuff I mentioned are all down in the description. So, until next time, council is adjourned.